knock, knock, howdy, folks. It's the Dr. Ben and Friends podcast where we're putting the med in comedy. Today we have special guests with us. I have a surgical first assistant, Mr. Adam, who actually works in the operating room and does surgeries with me. So he is here shining a light on healthcare heroes. And we have a history professor and stand-up comedian, Dr. Ben Sawyer. Are you all ready to play What the Heck? All right, we're celebrating healthcare heroes who make our lives healthier and funnier. And we are going to play What the Heck. Now, Adam is going to hold up some words or terms that we use every day in the operating room and in the medical field, but that Dr. Ben Sawyer in the history and comedy world may not be familiar. So he's going to pronounce them and tell us what he thinks they mean or what it's used for or the like. Are you ready to play, guys?
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Sounds fun.
Ready. And by the way, I'll say this. If I get it wrong, that is now what it is for. Okay?
That's right. It's the new definition.
Good thing everything in surgery has about 3 names.
Good.
All right. Adam, you're on. Let's go with the first word here. All right. Dr. Ben, what is this? Is this a historical?
Anastomosis.
Anastomosis. Okay.
Anastomosis.
How is he on pronunciation?
Anastomosis.
Oh, I
go.
like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Okay. Anastomosis. Okay.
Let's see.
Sound it out. What is that?
So anesto would have to do with like anesthesia, I'm guessing, and amosis would be, is that the process of anesthetizing a patient?
Okay. Good guess. Good
Is it
guess.
the osmosis of the anesthesia into the
Has
body?
something to do with osmosis of anesthesia?
Reverse osmosis, maybe? No. You want to help him out with that
Well,
one,
the
Dr.
first
Ben?
4 letters are anus. So-
Anus. Okay.
And the tumos.
Tomas or
Tomas.
not Tomas.
Anus Tomas, famous baseball player for the LA Dodgers back in the 19th. Is that right?
Could be.
Anastomosis.
I think that was on a jersey on his last name.
Anastomosis, daughter of Tsar Nicholas II.
Another. Is that a guess?
No,
I thought
that's
she was
not
fake.
it. I'm going to go with the first one, whatever that was.
Okay. With the anesthesia?
Yes.
Osmosis and anesthesia. Was he correct? Is he close? Mr. Adam?
No.
Oh.
Could have been nice about it or something.
What is anastomosis? What the heck? What the heck is anastomosis? I don't do that kind of procedure
You
in
don't do
orthopedics.
anastomosis? Oh, the orthopedics, yeah.
But you might do it in general surgery.
Yeah, bringing things together, repairing things, anastomosis.
Wait.
Like if you
Just
resect
fixing things?
a portion of a colon and then the pieces that are left, you have to bring them back together.
So we take a piece of the colon out and then we have to anastomose the other 2 healthy pieces
Stitch them together.
So it's like, again, back to the trocar, the tunnel analogy, which just like had a bad part of the tunnel and we're redirecting it.
But they sew the 2 ends back together after you take
It's
out
just
a
sort
piece.
of, anything that we
So it's called
reconnect.
anastomosis.
So you have that, and then when you take a piece of the colon out, what do you have? You have a semicolon.
Well, after a hemicolectomy, are you left with a semicolon?
Hemicolectomy, you get a semicolon. Yeah.
Are you left with a semicolon?
And just in the same way, no one's quite sure what to do with it.
All right, we got a grammar lesson. We got anastomosis. All right, good one. This one will be better. I'm confident. You got this one. Whoa, what the heck? What the heck? It's 2 words.
It's long.
What the heck?
Not that long, though.
Laparoscopic cholecystectomy.
Okay, how do you do on pronunciation?
Pretty close, actually.
Let's-
Okay, the first word I know you got right. Laparoscopic.
Laparoscopic.
And then the second word is
Laparoscopic cholecystectomy.
cholecystectomy. Now, what the heck is that, Dr.
Well,
Ben?
it's CHO,
Okay.
like cholesterol.
Okay, I see cholesterol, yeah.
Cyst is an ectomy is to remove something, right? So cyst would be like a growth, right?
Okay. Yeah, like you have a cyst.
Is this a cholesterol? Is this a? I don't know.
Removing a growth?
I'm going to put it through like to remove something from like a blockage from the circulatory system.
Okay. And what about the first word, laparoscopic?
Laparoscopic has to do with using laparoscopic has to do with like using certain tools, right? And narrow incisions, right? As opposed to just cutting a person open,
Okay.
right?
Or is it like when they're done
It's
performed seated, so they have a lap?
Laparoscopic, yeah.
Laparoscopic. It's when you get it done by a leper.
A leper.
Which
Someone with leprosy.
Yes, leprosy.
Yeah.
It removes,
For instance,
itself.
Which you can get from an armadillo.
Dr. Ben wouldn't do laparoscopy, he would do arthroscopy.
Okay.
Arthroscopic. Haha. Can't do laparoscopic. I'm just trying to make somebody else feel bad about what they can't do.
Haha.
I don't know what it means. Cholecystectomy.
It's one of the most common things we do. Laparoscopic is what we use the trocars for. That's a laparoscopic surgery. Instead of open, we use small portholes and a camera.
To go into the belly.
Your robot would have been laparoscopically robotic.
Right.
And then the cholecystectomy, choledoc, that's the gallbladder. So we're taking out the gallbladder.
Taking out the gallbladder. You were close, I feel.
All right, so like the cholecystic part, like what's that? Is that like the Latin term for a gallbladder?
Part of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they can't just say gallbladder removal. They have to sound smart.
I know you can't
No,
build a
yeah,
gallbladder.
we have to use
sounds like
that.
something
No.
your uncle could do. You know,
Right.
Get the gallbladder out. You know what I'm saying?
Then everyone would know what we're doing.
Love it.
We need esoteric terms like the laparoscopic cholecystectomy.
All right. This one will probably
Use
be
that today in
easier.
conversation if you can.
I will.
Laparoscopic cholecystectomy. All right, ready for the next word, Dr. Ben? You got this.
Yeah,
Ready,
just
Adam?
before I say this doesn't pertain to me.
Okay, this does not pertain to him. Oh, now what is this?
It says,
Is this even a real term?
this one's obvious. It says bear hugger.
Bear hugger. And how's bear spelled?
B-A-I-R.
Okay.
Bear
So someone did-
hugger.
Bear. Yeah.
Bear.
Bear.
I think they're from
Bear hugger.
Wisconsin.
The Wisconsin bear.
Bear hugger. That's what you call somebody who's always trying to like just save the bears that are in the. People are always trying to get rid of the bears in the
Someone's trying to save
surgery
them.
room, and somebody's like, "No, we got to keep these because of the environment," and that's a bear hugger. And, unlike tree huggers, these guys are always proven very wrong because when you hug a bear, I don't know if you've ever done it. Actually, I do know because you're all still alive.
What happened?
It's kind of a derogatory term for a person who hugged a bear.
So are you saying these people would always choose the bear over the man?
I don't think they feel like they have a choice, honestly. I feel like they think that they've been sent by God to protect the bear. And apparently they didn't even learn how to spell it. So are they committed or not? I'm not sure.
Fair enough.
Fair enough. Let's see. Was he close?
The words are correct. You said it correct for sure.
Okay.
It is not actually to do with real bears. It is to do with a type of gown or drape that we will put over the patient that hooks into basically a heater and keeps them warm during surgery. It's like a bear hug, I guess, to keep them warm.
Keeps them warm.
Blows. So, this is all right.
Okay.
This is you guys. I can see you guys. Your whole field is onto something because you didn't spell it B-A-R. I would have been like, oh, well, they're clearly, it said bear. I'm thinking it's named after some German chemist or something like that.
Yeah. Well, most of the stuff in surgery is named after like some old white man doctor usually, or it's some fancy name.
So it is eponymous.
That they can copyright. You can't copyright bear, B-E-A-R. But
And
you
it
can
turns
copyright
out
that.
it was an anesthesiologist, and his middle name was actually Baird, and so they called it the bear hugger. And so it's to keep patients warm. It blows warm air. It's like a blanket, and then you hook up looks like a vacuum tube to it.
Yeah,
and
it
blows
looks like,
warm
like
air.
when you get a package and it has those like blown up plastic things in there.
Oh,
When the
yeah.
air comes up, it sort of fills up with hot air. It looks like a bunch of that on the patient.
Okay. I'm not mad at it anymore. I was pretty mad at it.
Yeah.
So.
It's kind of cute, right?
But
How
Dr.
cool,
Ben
man.
could probably tell us the history of the teddy bear with Theodore Roosevelt.
Oh yeah, it's Teddy Roosevelt. It was like the teddy bear, right? Like it
He
goes
wanted
back
to save
like
some
his
bear or something,
association.
didn't he?
Yeah, it was like association with like I can't remember the exact story. That he had like caught a bear or
And he wanted to save it, so then they made the teddy bear from Teddy Roosevelt.
Oh.
yeah, that's where it goes back to.
Was that the first Beanie Baby?
Yeah, very rare Beanie Baby.
The only one that's still worth money.
Had a tag hanging from its ear.
You guys know
tie.
that in one of eBay's like earliest SEC filings, SEC filings for corporations, they have to state what could be a potential risk. Like their first SEC filing, they said the biggest threat to eBay was the collapse of the Beanie Baby bubble.
That was a big bubble too.
Seemed
that was
like a big
craze.
deal at the time.
It sure was, and that was ridiculous. Now let's get some Bitcoin.
That's right.
That's right. No one's getting stabbed in the parking lot over Bitcoin.
Not
But they
yet.
were for Beanie
Why, you
Babies.
got some? Anyway.
All right, Mr. Adam, ready for another word
All
here,
right.
Dr. Ben? Now, what? I bet you can pronounce all these. What
Army
is this?
Navy retractor.
Army Navy retractor. Okay. What do you think the Army Navy retractor is,
All right,
Dr. Ben
Let
Sawyer?
me say, so my one of my cousins is actually a drill instructor,
Okay.
drill sergeant in the
In
U.S.
the-
Army.
In the U.S. Army? Okay.
And he's told me about these people. These are people who sign up, get to basic training. It's too hard for them and make up something that's wrong with them so that they can get thrown out of the Army and not have to finish basic.
And they're called Army retractors?
That's Army retractor, right? And because if you do that, you also can't go to the Navy now. It's called
Sure,
an Army-Navy
Army-Navy
retractor. That's what they have to call them.
it. Is he right? That sounds plausible.
That sort of person might use one of these, but no, that's
Oh.
we're referring to a surgical instrument, actually.
Okay,
Oh,
so that is
okay.
the tool they use on the
so-
people to
So
lock
this
their hands
this
up.
here is an Army Navy. It's kind of a thin handled, maybe 12 inches long. It's got a long side and a short side. Which side do you think is the Army side? Which side do you think is the Navy side?
I refuse to answer on account of many of my family members are in the Army and some of my best friends are in the Navy.
That's very smart because it always depends on who you ask and where they served. The long end's always whatever branch they were in.
West Point says it's one end, and
they say this
Annapolis
hole in the
says
middle
it's
is for the
another.
Marines. No, actually, the hole in the middle, the myth behind that, I don't know if it's real or not, but the reason there's a hole in the middle is just because it was cheaper and used less metal.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But listener, he's holding this metal retractor. It's called one long end, one short end. And it's called the Army Navy retractor.
Army Navy, or also known as a USA or a U.S. Army retractor.
Now, is there like an Air Force Marines retractor?
Not that I've come across.
Okay, there should be.
Should be.
The Marines retractor is just way bigger and it talks about it a lot. Let's see.
And you have to say hoorah
Yeah.
when you use it.
So,
It's just way too big for the job.
all right. When I look at this,
Okay, what do you see?
All right.
What
So
do
if I walked in and this was laying on the dresser
Okay.
in my bedroom, I would think my wife has got a picture holder here
It looks
for
like
some-
a picture holder.
for
Okay.
some weird frame that kind of like, because it's like flat on the back, comes out a bit on the bottom, like at a 90-degree angle, and then comes up at like a 45-degree angle on the very tips. One's longer than the other one. I would think that she has some kind of a
Picture.
like you would bend back a little bit, snap in there, right?
Frame.
And then it would hold on the
For
wall.
a tablet, maybe.
And even though this doesn't make any sense for us in Nashville, she grew up in Los Angeles County. This would keep it on the wall if there was an earthquake.
Ah, okay. I like it. You can hook.
It would let you know if there's an earthquake happening.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If that's the only picture left on the wall, you go, there must have been an earthquake.
And so in surgery, as we dissect down, like maybe to get to the bone, we have to pull some soft tissue and muscle apart. So we could put one or two of those in to separate to get down to where we need to go. So this retractor would help pull muscle, soft tissue out of the way so I can get down to your broken bone. And so sometimes you need to be in more shallow, sometimes a little more deep, but this is to retract, pull apart soft tissues. And it's handheld. And so a first assistant like Mr. Adam would hold on this and pull tissue apart. So
Sometimes
do you
two
see
of
any
them.
like practical everyday application for a tool like that,
No, but you
Mr.
know
Ben?
what's surprising to me is that this right here, you said it was like to say metal. I would assume that there was some type of a peg that went in there that at some
hold.
point in time, if you have less manpower, you would clamp it down to hold it there. That's what I would have thought.
There's not. Sometimes I do use that hole for interesting things, but they're off book.
Yes, and I will not interrogate you further. But I mean, any use for this?
Back scratcher.
Oh,
Let's see. Let's try it.
You can't
Maybe
get the low
we-
back though.
no,
You have to
can't.
go the other
You
way.
can't get the low back.
Okay.
But eventually we'll reach around. It's pretty good. It's pretty good for that. I need to like really file the end up to get a little more of a scratch on there. But you could.
What
use
about
it
reacher if you had to grab something off a shelf? Or,
like just pull something down on top
Yeah.
of you? You could definitely do that with it. If you're like, I need that umbrella to fall on me. You could probably
That's
just
right.
like lurch it. It wouldn't catch it. And then you know what? Let's see.
The world's most aggressive dentist.
Just comes at you with this hacking at it.
Just
Hatchet
open your
in one
mouth.
hand in this thing. It's like, hold your mouth open. I think that's about. I mean,
Okay.
look, if it were laying around, I'd probably put it on top of stuff to keep stuff from blowing away. For example.
Paperweight.
But that's kind of everything in it.
Okay. I like it. All right, Mr. Adam, you use this every day. Any practical everyday applications for this?
Not usually.
Okay.
Although
think he's already
it might help to scramble your eggs. Maybe, I don't know.
Okay. Utensil.
Yeah, but
In
not
the
with
kitchen.
nonstick. It would probably scratch too much.
That's what I was just thinking. We need it. You know what we need? We need a plastic version of that that's compatible with our nonstick modern pans.
I like it. All right. Do we have another word as I scratch my back with
I
the Army Navy?
do have another word here.
Thank you to all our servicemen, by the way, for keeping us safe.
Army, Navy, Marines,
For not
Air Force,
retracting
Space
like
Force.
some people.
National Guard.
All right.
Electrocautery. That is where you use cautery is to cut off the flow of blood, right? So I would imagine that you're like cauterizing parts of the circulatory system with something that heats up through means of electricity.
And basically that, yeah. I mean, there's various types of electrocautery, but yeah.
After that last one, you guys were like, he's definitely not going to get any of these right. And then you gave me that one.
Using electricity and often heat to control bleeding.
That's
Heck
right.
yeah.
And an instrument called the BOVI, which is probably an eponym, but we do that to cauterize or stop bleeding. And so, when I first met my wife, she was actually very impressed with the way I used the BOVI. It doesn't sound like a lot, but that's how I cauterize. That's how I cauterize. Mm-hmm.
If you guys would have met online, then it would have been electrocauterized.
That's right. That's how I cauterize, folks. All right. Good job, Dr. Ben. How do you do, Adam?
Pretty good considering.
Okay.
Midterm's hard. It's a whole class.
That's right. And a new addition here, we also have another tool here. And Mr. Adam's going to show a surgical instrument. And Dr. Ben here is going to hold it up. All right. What do you think this is?
That is a mallet.
Mallet? Okay.
I'm familiar with that just because, like I said, I built houses. And I know it's not a hammer if it's got one on both sides. So
Yeah, we don't like to call it the hammer. It's not appropriate.
Is this like when we call the surgery to order? Do we?
That's what I was wondering. Is that when someone makes a mistake?
Yeah. Order.
I've never seen that done,
Okay.
but maybe.
Looks like a gavel.
Yeah, it does. This one does look kind of like a gavel. There's a specific name for this one. Honestly, off the top of my head, I don't know it.
Okay.
But this one's
When
got
might-
a little bit of a curve to it now.
When might a surgeon use a mallet in surgery, Dr. Ben?
I'm just thinking like if you're, this is heavy. It's got some weight to it, right?
Okay.
I'm trying to see, is it equal? It looks like this side's got a little more weight to it maybe. Or is it equally? And we can actually figure this out somehow.
Like, would we use that to remove a gallbladder?
It probably, if you wanted to get charged with manslaughter after you did it, it'd probably be great for that. Let's see. Maybe look, we're not see. Oh, okay, wait.
Maybe like a
Have
craniotomy?
you used this in the surgery room before?
Maybe not that one. This
Someone
one I
has.
think has been decommissioned. I think we have different models now.
Okay, because this has got Mars in the
Yeah,
face
Right. I think
of
that's
it.
why it's
Many
been
years of use.
Okay, so
decommissioned.
it's hitting something hard then.
Right. Good.
Mhm.
So this
Detective
is you're not
work
checking
here.
reflexes with this. If you are,
Right. Is that a
you've got
reflex
another
hammer?
surgery to do.
Yeah,
But it's
I
also-
think that's the sort of reflex hammer you use when you're looking for extra business.
That's
It's,
right. You also have a patella fracture.
That's right.
Your kneecap is broken.
Yeah, good news. You're already here. Just write that bill code up. But it's the scratches are real narrow on this thing.
Mm.
So I wondered if it would be a thing that you would actually use with a chisel somehow if you're
Okay.
working with bones.
And what do we call the chisel in surgery, Dr. Adam?
There are actual chisels, but mostly osteotomes are what
Right.
we use. Yeah.
There are actual chisels we use. They're called osteotomes.
And they must be precise because where it's hitting, there's not a super wide gap. So it's hitting something very narrow and very thin, but it's hitting it pretty hard. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, the osteotomes come in various sizes from maybe
Narrow
like a
to-
quarter of an inch
Tink, 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 tink.
to, full size inch and a half.
What's interesting is that this side has clearly been used a lot, and this side doesn't have any of that, almost none. It's strange
Oh.
because it's like weighted the same.
They seem to have.
Someone had a
It's
preference for this
symmetrical
side.
too,
preference.
but they preferred one side over the other. Interesting.
So a lot of times, do other specialties besides orthopedics use mallets?
A little bit, yes, depending on
Okay.
what we're doing. I mean, like the spine surgeons, obviously,
Okay.
will have mallets. There's different sizes. When you're working in like on the spine, it's usually a smaller mallet.
So I use a mallet a lot in orthopedic surgery.
I would
Which
imagine.
is much like carpentry. Saws, screwdrivers,
Yeah.
hammers, or mallets. So it's a lot.
Sometimes you have that really large mallet when you do the hip.
Don't make the
Like
mistake
Thor's
of hiring
hammer.
someone who doesn't have any actual experience doing it.
So like Thor probably would have been an orthopedic surgeon if he were.
He was in the comic books, actually, I believe.
Okay.
His alter ego,
Was a
Dr. Donald Blake. He would transform into Thor, I think like in like the 70s or whatever. But he was an orthopedic surgeon with a hammer. Yeah.
Wait, for
makes
real?
sense.
Yeah.
That was funny when I thought you were making it up.
No,
when
no,
I think
that's
about it, it sounds very lame.
I mean, well, this was, writing comics in like the
stereotype.
60s, 70s was
Like, who
probably
else
pretty
uses a
straightforward.
hammer?
Yeah.
No.
Gotta find something he can do. He can't just be the Hulk.
You also use mallets in woodworking,
Right.
I mean, generally when I think about using a mallet for something, it's with the big softer head.
The rubber, yeah.
Yeah, so that you're like
Rubber
trying to get, you're trying to get something in without damaging it, right?
Mm-hmm. Maybe we should use those.
Yeah, we do have, there are specialty mallets that have like surgery grade like plastic on them that's like to reduce force.
It feels nice. It's like the weighting on it feels nice.
All right.
I like
When you're
hammers.
carrying a
Yeah.
hammer, everything looks like a nail. Speaking of, did I tell you guys that Mike Tyson and Chris Hemsworth were working out? And Mike Tyson looked at Chris Hemsworth and said, "Tomorrow you're going to be Thor."
Oh,
Yeah.
that's how I figured out who Chris Hemsworth was right there.
He's, Thor.
Yeah, it's interesting because they're both guys that seem to skip leg day.
That's right. All right. Well, good. Well, thank you both for playing along.
Thank you.
Order.
Hereby call
Order.
this a session.